We're now going to look at mimicry. Now, mimicry is kind of like a subclass of analogous traits, and as such, you cannot use mimicry type traits as the basis for phylogenetic relationships. So what's going on with mimicry is where we have an adaptive similarity of traits among independent hereditary lines. Again, it's like analogous traits, but there's a specific adaptation in terms of mimicry that's unique to mimicry that you won't necessarily find in the broader class of analogous traits. So think of this more as a subclass. So there's two types of mimicry. Batesian mimicry, where we have our mimic and the model that it's mimicking. So what's going on with Batesian mimicry is that the mimic is non-poisonous, but the model is. And so the mimic is actually gaining some kind of an adaptive advantage by appearing to look like the model. Now, it's not always a perfect match, as we'll see, but sometimes it can be pretty close. For Mullerian mimicry, all of the individuals, both the mimic and the model, are poisonous. Usually one will be more poisonous than the other. More often than not, that will be the model. But they all share some degree of toxicity. And that's not the case with Batesian, because the mimic in Batesian mimicry is totally non-toxic. So let's start by looking at some examples of Batesian mimicry. There are many more examples in the animal kingdom of Batesian than Mullerian. So let's start by looking at viceroy and monarch butterflies. The viceroy is not toxic, it's not poisonous, whereas the monarch is. And the reason for that has to do with what they were eating when they were caterpillars, in other words, before metamorphosis. Viceroy caterpillars eat willow plants, and there's no toxicity in the leaves of willow plants. Monarch caterpillars, on the other hand, eat milkweed, and there is toxicity in the milkweed. It's just that they are immune to it. So what's happening is that the milkweed is passing on toxicity to the caterpillar, and then when the caterpillar metamorphoses into a butterfly, it is then going to pass that toxicity along to the butterfly, giving it adaptive advantages. But because the viceroy, which is not poisonous, looks like the monarch, well, you know what? It is sharing in those adaptive advantages. This explains it further.
What seemed to be identical butterflies emerge from each chrysalis. The monarch on the right has kept its coloration, advertising its toxicity. But what about the viceroy on the left? Aptly named as a stand-in for the king, it wears the monarch's bright colors. Has it become toxic through metamorphosis? No, it just looks that way. Wherever the viceroy goes, it travels under false colors. The monarch travels under true ones. Does this resemblance do the viceroy any good? Recent research has shown that it does, because predators remember not to repeat unpleasant encounters. This blue jay, which eats panthea moths, has a taste for butterflies too. But this one has never eaten monarch or viceroy. When presented here with a monarch, the naive jay catches it, dismembers it, and eats it. As we shall see later on in another sequence, birds are not born knowing how to hunt. They have to learn the hard way. After about 12 minutes, the milkweed toxin in the monarch begins to affect the jay. It could make the jay extremely ill, but it contains an emetic, causing the jay to regurgitate before the poison does any real harm. After the blue jay recovers, if he's given a choice between the edible mimic, the viceroy, and the equally edible swallowtail, Will he choose based on his memory of the monarch's colors? He eats the swallowtail, rejecting the viceroy. The jay cannot tell the model from the mimic, so he will now avoid both monarch and viceroy. Because of the predator's capacity to learn, the non-toxic viceroy has survived by trading on the reputation of the monarch. It pays to advertise.
So there's learning involved here. So obviously the viceroy is only going to gain the advantage if it happens to be in areas where there are birds that have been eating monarchs and therefore getting ill. But nonetheless, it's enough to give it, generally speaking at least, an adaptive advantage simply by mimicking the monarch. But again, it does depend on the birds themselves having learned about the toxicity of the monarch in the first place. Eyes of predators, bird predators like hawks and owls. This is an owl. Eyes can be rather striking. And in fact, eyes have provided a basis for Batesian mimicry in many other forms of animals. Eyes have been actually mimicked to the mimic's advantage. So we see eye spots on butterfly wings, for example. Of course, these are not functional eyes, they're just eye spots, colorations. There's a moth with eye spots, more moths with eye spots. You see these in a variety of species. There's yet another one. There's another one. There's a whole bunch of eye spots on this one. There's a caterpillar, again, eye spots. Another caterpillar species, eye spots. And yet another. It almost looks like a turtle. It's a caterpillar. Another caterpillar. And yet another. Now this is actually a frog. When the frog is threatened, it can inflate its body. Now we're looking at the back end of the frog. Now when it does that, typically the predator would be behind the frog trying to grab it because the frog is trying to hop away. It exhibits these really large eye spots, which is enough to drive many predators away. There is a fish. It has eye spots on the tail fin. Of course, its real eye is up front. Again, some people view this as one large eye spot. It's on the back portion, the back fin, the back body, actually, of the fish. These are fish with eye spots on fins. So we look at there's this real eye there because there's the mouth. But that fin has an eye spot. That fin has an eye spot. Again, we see the same thing here. Here's the front of this fish. There's its real eye. Eye spot, eye spot. And here we have a situation with predator-induced mimicry. Now this is kind of interesting because the eye spot actually becomes more apparent. It grows in size only when the damselfish actually detects the presence of a predator, which in this case, in this experiment, it's a different type of fish. Now that other fish is behind the barrier, and there's our damselfish, and notice that as it detects the presence of the predator, because it can see it through the barrier, and there are pheromones that the predator is emitting, not really pheromones, but other chemical substances that the predator is emitting that are also detectable by the damselfish, the eye spot on the damselfish grows and grows larger. And here we can see the early eye spot development on the damselfish on the left, and as the predator continues to be present, it gets even larger, as we see in the photograph on the right. We refer to this general phenomenon as phenotypic plasticity because we have the phenotype. A phenotype is like a trait, a characteristic of the animal, and in this case, the phenotype happens to be the eye spot. But there's plasticity in the fact that it's not always there in its large form. It actually develops and grows only when there is a predatory fish in the environment of the damselfish. there's a bird that's incubating. And there are what people have interpreted as eye spots on the wings, because when the predator comes near the nest and it doesn't want to leave the nest because hormonal events are keeping that bird as close to its eggs as possible to defend them, as well as its hatchlings as soon as they hatch. So it spreads its wings out like this when a predator comes near the nest, revealing what appear to be these huge eyes. People who work in bird sanctuaries where birds nest will sometimes put eye spots on their hats, because birds will dive bomb when you're going in their nesting area. And this will keep them, they'll still try, but it keeps them further away. You're less likely to get hit. In reality, you're less likely to get hit anyway, but I have been in a bird sanctuary where a person with me actually did get hit on the top of the head, enough to draw blood. But these eye spots are just more insurance to prevent that from happening. There's a spider, eye spots. It's the Hawaiian happy face spider. Also has a happy mouth. Another one, again, eye spots, but a happy mouth. I mean, it actually looks like a full face. That's why the official name is the happy face spider. And here's another spider, and you can see eye spots. Oh, wait a minute. I wonder if it really is a spider. Well, obviously you know it's not. So what are we looking at? There's the front of the animal. Those are actual wings. The abdomen has eye spots, but there's also leg-like coloration on the wings. It's actually a fly. It's a species of fly that mimics a spider. This is an ant-mimicking spider. So it's a spider that actually mimics an ant.
Ants are notoriously annoying. And when we see this one, we think we recognize it at once. It seems to have an ant's biting mandibles and an ant's sensitive antennae. But it's not an ant. It's not even an insect. It's an ant-mimicking spider. It trades on one of the more infamous reputations in nature, that of the ant, whose mandibles can inflict painful bites. On the left is the spider, on the right is the ant.
Now, of course, the ant-mimicking spider is not poisonous in any way. If it were, then this would be a case for Mullerian mimicry rather than Batesian. The metalmark moth actually mimics a jumping spider, so much so that it totally fools the jumping spider, because jumping spiders like to eat moths in general, and normally they would go after any moth. But you can see a spider mimicking moth over here, even some eye spots on its wings. Here's our jumping spider over here, which also has eye spots, actually on the back as well. Eyes are everywhere on these animals. Anyway, let's look at the situation here. Here we have a jumping spider that is just attacking a non-mimic moth. It's a different species of moth. It's not a metal mark. So this is just to show that jumping spiders like to attack and eat moths. It's a control group. Jumping spider down there is going after the moth. Moth tries to fly away. Not as good as the jumping spider. Okay, now here is a jumping spider up on the wall in back, and the moth, well, a moment ago, the moth was on the floor. And that's the moth over on the left. The jumping spider was on the floor. They're both on the side. The moth is closer to us right now. What we're seeing in the spider with the raising of those limbs is actually a threat display. It's the kind of thing that a jumping spider would do if another jumping spider were to suddenly appear in its environment. So it really is. It's not just avoiding the metalmark moth. It's actually treating it as if it's another jumping spider, which is kind of interesting. Continues to threaten it. And just to show you that I'm not lying, I never lie. Here we have on the bottom a jumping spider threatening an intruder. That's another jumping spider up on the wall of the cage. So the territory holder, that jumping spider down below, is doing that threat display. Okay, that's a vine snake. It really is. And that's a caterpillar, a mimic of the snake. But the caterpillar, as we're viewing it, looks more like a poisonous snake because it can actually inflate the end of its body that contain those two eye spots to make it appear like a deadly snake. So let's look at this. Here it is when it's not inflated at all. It doesn't even look like a snake. But if threatened, then it can inflate the end of that body, making it look like a poisonous snake. The caterpillar itself is not poisonous. This is Batesian mimicry. And this octopus, this is an amazing octopus discovered, I think, in Indonesia in 1998 that impersonates a whole variety of venomous animals wherever it is sympatric with those animals. Sympatric means they live in the same area, okay? So here we have the normal appearance. That's the way the octopus really looks when it's not changed its color or shape to mimic something. But it's a miraculous octopus. It can change both its color and its shape to try to mimic what it is it's seeing. It's not a perfect mimicry, but it works. So here we have the venomous model, a banded sea snake, highly poisonous snake, by the way. And now look at that octopus. It's changed its shape entirely and the color pattern to mimic the banded sea snake. Here is a banded sole, a flatfish, which is poisonous. And now look at the octopus. Again, not perfect, but good enough. The lionfish, very, very poisonous. Now look at the octopus. And this shows it even more dramatically.
To avoid vicious predators like sharks, the octopus changes its shape, color, and texture in an instant to look like rock and algae. This strange creature was unknown until it was spotted, first by fishermen off the coast of Indonesia in the 1990s. It looked like an octopus, but it could morph its shape in an instant to appear as seemingly any animal around it. At first, no one had any idea what it was.
The first time I saw it, I just was blown away. You couldn't get a more spectacular animal. It really is the pinnacle of wizardry.
Biologist Mark Norman was the first scientist to study this seemingly shapeless creature. He named it the mimic octopus.
The mimic octopus makes itself look like a living, moving animal. So it pulls all its arms around behind its body and swims along like a poisonous flatfish called a banded sole. In other cases, if it's getting attacked, it puts 6 arms down a hole and raises the other 2 arms to look like a poisonous sea snake that has bands along its body. If that's not enough, it'll swim along looking like a poisonous lionfish with these banded arms looking like the banded spines that come off these very deadly fish.
So far, 15 separate species are known to be in the mimic octopus act, and Norman is not always sure exactly what the mimic is doing. He observed this mimic scuttling along the sea bottom, looking something like a furry turkey with human legs.
Sometimes it's hard when you watch a mimic octopus doing what it does to interpret what's going on. It's a bit like looking at ink spots in a psychiatrist's office going, I don't know what that is. It could be a piano, it could be a fridge. So you get 3 or 4 divers together and you'll argue all night trying to work out what we think it was mimicking.
As we have seen, newly discovered Indonesian mimic octopus has added an important skill. The ability not only to blend in with the background, but to assume the shape of frightening predators.
I don't think they learn their models as they grow. I think this is an evolutionary memory.
Biologist Mark Norman believes the mimic evolved perhaps 50 million years ago, when it moved out of the safety of coral reefs in search of new food sources and onto the shallow sandy plains off the Indonesian coast, where even an octopus can't hide.
When you swim around in these areas, there's no protection, no reef, no coral cover. It'd be like trying to match a white piece of paper. And the only other animals that are out during the day on these sand plains are covered in spines or are poisonous.
For the evolving mimic, the flip side of survival of the fittest was death to bad actors.
No predators will allow a bad mimic to live more than about 3 minutes. These animals have evolved into such tight mimics because they have such bad critics.
So again, obviously an adaptive advantage for this non-poisonous octopus to mimic animals that are very, very poisonous. This is a caterpillar from South America, and it is poisonous. And here we can see it in the woods, slowly moving around, mostly its head. Very typical of caterpillar type behavior. Again, pretty subtle. There you can see it. Slowly moving its head around. Uh-oh, wait a minute. No, it's a bird. It's not a caterpillar. Oh, you probably saw something like that coming. Yes, this is a bird from South America that mimics this poisonous caterpillar. And there's the caterpillar once again, and you can see that there is some basic similarity, maybe some darker spots on the bird. Actually, this bird is probably about 4 to 6 days old. Just before this period, those dark spots would not quite have emerged yet, and it would have looked a little bit more like the caterpillar. So, it's called the Sirenius warbler, and here it is just a little bit older. Quite active. Now watch, a parent is going to come into the background and land on a branch. In just a second, right there. And notice that the chick is not gaping. It's not doing what most chicks of other species of this type would typically do. It's sitting there rather calmly. And in fact, if we even go back and look a day or so earlier, so the chick is in the nest, and the parent has brought food back to the nest, but you don't see any intense gaping. Just a little bit of movement, perhaps. You can see the chick a little bit. But nothing like the intense gaping that we typically see in these kinds of birds. Now, it turns out, and we're not going to see that in this clip, that the parent does have a special vocalization that it utters, and that once it does that, then the chick will become very, very active. Otherwise, it remains rather quiet. So it's probably a protective mechanism so that, if there's a predator that accidentally hits the nest, bumps into the nest, the side of the nest or whatever, that the chick won't be fooled into thinking it's its parent returning and will remain pretty quiet. The Sirenius mourner. Okay, there is a phenomenon called frequency-dependent Batesian mimicry, and we see it in snakes. We see it in snakes found in the eastern United States, as well as other species found in the western part of the United States. So in the eastern part of the United States, we have the eastern coral snake, which is very, very poisonous, but the scarlet king snake is not, and it's non-poisonous, but it does mimic it in terms of coloration. The western United States, we have the poisonous western coral snake, but the non-poisonous Sonoran mountain king snake. And again, there's similarity in the coloration of these non-poisonous mimics. The interesting thing about this is it has to do with the predators of these snakes. The snakes will only avoid eating or even attacking the non-poisonous mimics only where the non-poisonous mimics are sympatric with the poisonous mimics, because you will find these non-poisonous mimics in areas where you don't have the poisonous snakes. So only where they're sympatric, where they live in the general vicinity of one another, will the predators avoid those mimics. So at least where they are sympatric, this mimicry works really, really well. And unlike the octopus, by the way, these non-poisonous snakes don't turn that coloration on and off. That's the way they always look. So let's go on and look at a couple examples of Mullerian mimicry. So here we have a poisonous flatworm that mimics a poisonous coral snake. They're both poisonous, but they are very, very different creatures. It's Mullerian, so definitely not Batesian because they're both poisonous. And this is an interesting situation. This is a relatively recently discovered group of birds, the Pitahui. I think I'm pronouncing that relatively correctly. And there's several species. I think there might be 3 species. And they're all poisonous. Some are more poisonous than others. Now, it's very unusual to have any species of bird that's poisonous, so that's kind of unique in and of itself. And in fact, nobody really even expected to encounter this. Well, the person who discovered this group of animals was Jack Dumbacher back in 1992, discovered all 3 species in New Guinea, found out they're all poisonous, but he found out the hard way. So he was misnetting the birds because he wanted to trap them and ban them so he could keep track of them. And of course, you catch a bird, fine. Birds have claws, like reptiles, because they evolved from reptiles. And so his hand got scratched on one occasion, probably more than one occasion. But he wasn't thinking one day and actually licked it. You know, so you scratch yourself, you lick your hand, whatever. Not a good thing to do anyway. But as a result, his mouth became numb for several hours, very shortly after he licked it. So he caught one of the birds. He figured it had to be some kind of toxin in the bird. And you see the name of it. That's the name of the toxin. I'm not going to try to pronounce it. But in any event, he sent the bird to a lab for analysis. And they discovered that sure enough, this toxin was found in the feathers of these birds. It wasn't something that was transmitted through the claws per se, but the whole bird was basically toxic, but primarily in the feathers. So, you know, I mean, the birds use the claws to preen their feathers, so of course it's going to be transmitted to their claws as well. Basically, the toxin that we're looking at here is the same toxin that we see in poison dart frogs of South and Central America. And that, of course, is a photoshopped version of a poisonous dart frog. But nonetheless, they are very colorful animals, by the way. We'll look at a couple in a minute. But they're used, of course, as a means of getting poison by people who live down there. So that's why they're called poison dart frogs. You just get some of the skin poison on the dart, and then you shoot the dart at people, and now you kill people. Not a good idea, but it's a deadly poison. So here we have some real poison dart frogs from South and Central America. I told you they were really, really colorful. And you might be wondering, well, why would the birds have evolved this poison in their feathers? It's very unusual, as I said. Well, it turns out that at least for these birds, it helps keep the lice off of the feathers. It's poisonous to the lice. And so it's one way to protect them against annoying lice. So why aren't all birds poisonous? Well, they aren't. What can I tell you? Okay, so there you go. Our 2 categories of mimicry, Batesian mimicry and Mullerian mimicry.